Ready up for the jury? Stay ready.
Yes, sir.
Okay, bring jury in, please. All right, jury's back. Please be seated. Good morning. Let me ask you again, if anyone has come into contact with any information on this case that you left yesterday evening, please raise your hand. I see no hands, so Mr. Griffith, you may proceed.
Thank you, Judge. We would recall Mr. Infinger.
Good morning. Please be seated. You're still in early.
Great, Judge. Investigator Infinger, please restate your full name for the jury and spell your last name for the court reporter.
Matt Infinger, I-N-F-I-N-G-E-R.
And you're the same Matt Infinger that previously testified as the lead homicide investor in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, during the course of this case, the state has introduced a will that was prepared by Mr. Roddenberry Jr. and was executed by Voncile Smith. Are you aware of that will?
Yes.
Where did you find that will?
I did not. The family found it.
And you're not talking about Mr. Hartung?
No, it was some of the family from Mobile, Wanda Hammock, and I don't recall the other two names.
Okay. Did they bring that will to you?
No, I believe they took it to the attorney. They told me about it, and I contacted the attorney.
Okay. So it was already opened at the time you received it?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have here.
No questions, Judge.
Okay, thank you, sir.
He's free to leave, Your Honor.
All right, next witness, please.
Christine Rollins.
Good morning. Please be seated. You're still in early.
Good morning. Would you state your name, please, and spell your last name?
Christine Rollins, R-O-L-L-I-N-S.
Okay. Ms. Rollins, when you went to the scene on July 31st of 2015, did you walk back to the room that was Voncile's closet?
I went back to her room, yes, ma'am. I didn't go in her closet.
Okay. You photographed the entrance to the closet,
Yes, ma'am.
but you didn't actually walk in there?
No, ma'am.
When you photographed the entrance to the closet, did you see a safe anywhere?
No, ma'am.
Also, when you were at the scene on that same day, did you turn over Richard's body?
No, ma'am, I did not.
Did you see who did?
It would probably be the medical examiner's office people.
But that's just speculation on your part?
I don't normally touch the bodies.
Okay. There were over 400 pieces of evidence that were collected, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you change gloves after you handled each single piece of evidence?
No, ma'am.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
I'm showing you what has been entered as Defendant's Exhibit 21. Is this a photograph you took?
I'm not sure.
Okay. This is a photograph that's in the house, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. At the scene?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and you're not sure if you took it or if someone else took it?
No, I'm not sure.
Did you fingerprint that thermostat?
No, ma'am.
Did you swab it for DNA?
No, ma'am.
Do you know who turned down the temperature on that thermostat?
No, ma'am.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm showing you what was entered as State's Exhibit 18.
Oh, okay.
Is this a photograph that you took?
Yes, ma'am.
In this photograph, this is looking in the back door of the Smith home from the back porch, is that right?
I think it was the front door.
Okay. So if it's looking in the front door, would you agree that the door itself is completely open?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what about the storm door? Is it in a position where it's propped open?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any idea how long it was propped open?
No, ma'am.
And the evidence room at the sheriff's office, is that a sterile environment?
All the counters are wiped down before and after we clean, or before and after we process evidence.
But is it actually a sterile environment?
No, ma'am.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Mr. Rollins, just a couple questions. Do you take overall photographs before the medical examiner gets there?
Yes, sir.
Were the bodies moved before the medical examiner's investigators got there?
No, sir.
Did you have any contact with Donald Hartung?
No, sir.
You ever seen him before at the scene?
No, sir.
Touch him?
No, sir.
I'm going to show you states 413. You recognize 413?
Yes, sir.
And where is that located?
It's in the den area.
Is that in the doorway of the den area?
Yes, sir.
And what's on the other side of the doorway?
The hallway that leads to the back door.
Now, the blue things on, it looks like shoes.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the jury what those are?
They're booties. They're shoe covers that you wear when you come into a crime scene. You change them every time you go outside and you come back inside.
And all the crime scene techs that were there that day, did they use those booties?
Yes, sir, they did.
And is that an accurate copy of that photograph and those booties?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to move in 413.
No, yeah.
So noted.
Now, you testified that you did not change your gloves every time you touched a piece of evidence, right?
Correct.
If you touch something with obvious bodily fluids, do you change your gloves?
Yes, sir.
Every time?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Those are my questions.
No further questions.
All right, thank you. Sit down. All right, next witness, please.
Dr. Arden.
Good morning. Would you raise your right hand, please? Morning, Your Honor. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you give to be the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Please be seated.
Thank you, sir.
If you would, sir, please state your full name for the court and spell your last name for the court reporter.
I'm Dr. Jonathan Arden. Last name is A-R-D-E-N.
Dr. Arden, what is your profession?
I'm a physician, and in particular, I am a forensic pathologist.
What does it mean to be a forensic pathologist?
Well, first of all, pathology in general is the medical specialty that studies the changes in the form or the function of the human body. And by changes, I'm talking about the effects of diseases or injuries. So if you take that general field, and then it is initially divided into two major pieces, one of which is anatomic pathology, which is the study of the changes of the anatomy, meaning the structures, and that includes both what you can see with the naked eye and what you can look at under the microscope. Then finally, if you take the broad background of general medicine and anatomic pathology, and then you primarily apply it to the process of investigation and certification of death, particular types of deaths, in particular deaths that occur by injuries. So any death where any injury causes the death or plays a role in causing the death, and also deaths that occur suddenly and unexpectedly, such as people who die in public or without medical care. It's that process of basically figuring out how and why those kinds of people die that is forensic pathology.
And does that include people that die as a result of criminal activity?
Yes, sir.
What qualifies you to be a forensic pathologist?
Well, in terms of my education and training and experience, to begin with, after I graduated from college, I then attended and graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School, receiving my MD or Doctor of Medicine in 1980. I then served in two medical specialty training programs. The first was a 3-year residency in anatomic pathology, and that was at the New York University Medical Center in New York City. I then served one additional year of training in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland. Subsequent to my education and training, I have become board certified by the American Board of Pathology in 1985 in both anatomic and forensic pathology. I then embarked on a career as a forensic pathologist. I spent a total of 20 years in full-time government service as a medical examiner. I worked in 4 different offices, including 9 years for the city of New York, where I rose through several titles and finished there as the first deputy chief medical examiner, the second in command to that system. I then spent about 5.5 years as the chief medical examiner for the city of Washington, D.C. At the completion of that period, which was, as I said, about 20 years of government service, I primarily went out and started a private consulting practice in forensic pathology and medicine, the type of work that brings me here today. Overlapping with that, I spent about 18 months in a part-time community-based medical examiner position in Northern Virginia, which is where I live. For the past, where we're coming up to almost 12 years now, I have held a part-time, I continue to hold a part-time position as a forensic pathologist with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of West Virginia. And in that latter part-time position, I do the usual functions of a medical examiner, including performing autopsies, writing reports, being available for court. But I only do that as a part-time activity, and the rest of my time being my consulting practice, work that brings me here today. In addition to those qualifications, I'm currently licensed to practice medicine in 4 states. In terms of professional activities, I've been a member and active in the National Association of Medical Examiners for over 30 years now. I've served on the board of directors and the executive committee, and last year I was president of the National Association of Medical Examiners, and so this year I'm the chairman of the board.
And what states are you licensed to practice medicine in?
I have active licenses to practice in Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia, and I have what's called an inactive license in the state of New York.
Have you testified as an expert witness in court in the past?
On numerous occasions, yes, sir.
Have you testified in Florida in the past?
Yes, sir.
Now, you indicated that you were a board-certified forensic pathologist. What does it mean to be a board-certified forensic pathologist?
Each of the medical specialties in this country has a governing board. So for me, that's the American Board of Pathology. Each of these boards puts together standards for education and training, and if you can demonstrate that you fulfill those standards of education and training and that you hold an active medical license, and if you fill out the application and pay them a healthy fee, they permit you to sit for examinations in your specialty and subspecialty fields. And of course, assuming you pass those examinations, you have demonstrated your level of accomplishment in each of those fields, and then they certify you, in my case, both in anatomic pathology and in forensic pathology.
So you're a double board certified pathologist.
I guess you really technically say I'm board certified in a specialty and a subspecialty, but yes, it's two boards.
Now, as far as being a board-certified forensic pathologist, how many of them are there in the United States?
Not many. There's on the order of 400 to 500 board-certified forensic pathologists in the country, not all of whom practice full-time.
Now, I retained you to assist me in the case of State of Florida versus Donald Wayne Hartung. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And when did you begin working on this case?
Mid to late November of 2018.
And how are you being paid?
I'm being paid by the state of Florida.
Are you being paid through the Judicial Administration Commission?
Yes, sir.
Have you been paid anything to date?
No, sir. Apparently, we only get to submit bills at the end.
And do you know what your hourly rate is?
Yes, sir.
What is that?
$400 an hour.
And how many hours do you have in so far?
I'm just about 20 hours total at this point before today.
What information or materials have you reviewed to prepare for your testimony today?
Most importantly, I had both the autopsy report, the report of investigation by the medical examiner, and the toxicology report for each of the three decedents, being John, Richard, and Voncile Smith. I also had some photographs of the scene, and at some point I received some of the autopsy photographs. I also had some interviews and some police reports and the like.
You mean interviews, you were given copies of the interviews?
Yes, sir. And ultimately, transcripts of some depositions as well.
Okay. And do you feel qualified based upon the photographs, the interviews, the crime scene photographs, the medical examiner's report, the autopsy report, and the interviews to discuss this case today?
I do.
What was the first thing that came to your attention in reviewing this case?
Well, I guess several things. I know you're asking the first thing, but several things struck me initially. It's an unusual circumstance to have three decedents in one event or location. Triple homicides are not common events, so that struck me initially. The circumstances in which the decedents were discovered at the house with the clothing on top of them and so on was of note to me. The nature of the injuries of each of them was something that was notable to me from early on in the process. And then also I had thoughts and concerns about the postmortem interval, the timing of death.
All right. In reviewing the autopsy notes of the pathologist who handled this case, can you tell me how long each autopsy took?
I cannot tell you how long each one took. Each of the autopsy reports had a starting time listed, and the three of them were actually very closely spaced in time as far as what she said was the starting time. One was, I think, 10:02, one was 10:07, and I believe one was 10:12. So within a 10-minute period, she listed all three of them as having started. There were no end times listed on any of them, so it tells me that she had three autopsies going simultaneously, and I don't know if we have a way to track how long each one took.
Is that unusual to have three autopsies going at one time?
It is unusual. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual, and of course, I think it's much more difficult to keep your attention on what you're doing on one when you're trying to track all three.
Now, there has been testimony that a dog was locked in the house, and it's been posited that the Smiths were murdered on Tuesday, the 28th of July, and the bodies were not discovered until Friday, the 30th of July, 31st of July, excuse me. Did you see anything odd about having a dog locked in the house with these three people for that period of time?
Yes, sir.
And can you explain that to the jury?
Yes. When a person dies in an enclosed environment like a closed house, house pets, commonly cats and dogs, when they get to the point where they don't have any other food source, they've exhausted whatever there is, they will then feed on the dead body. That's a very common phenomenon. And so the idea that there were three dead people in this house over a period of days, purportedly, and the dog was there and had not fed on any of the people, I found unusual.
Have you done autopsies where animals have actually fed on the deceased?
Yes, sir.
And is that part of the medical literature that that sort of thing happens?
Yes, it is in the literature and the experience in forensic pathology.
Now, next thing I want to talk to you about are what are called, I think, Botflies. Is that?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the jury about that?
Well, there are different species of insects, and most commonly we deal with flies that will be attracted to dead bodies. So if you have a dead body in a place that is accessible to the flies, they are attracted to it. They will lay eggs on various parts of the body, and then if there's enough time, the eggs will go through their developmental cycles, which includes making larvae of the flies, which we know as maggots. Those things will feed on the dead body tissue, and again, if there's sufficient time, will go through their entire cycle such that eventually they'll produce a new generation of flies.
Do you know how long it takes for the fly eggs to turn into the maggots?
It's usually a period of days. Different species are slightly different in timing, but you can go through an entire generation of flies in warm temperature in roughly a week or so. So several days out, you should have maggots.
Okay. Now, I know the bodies recovered. I think there were 19 bags of clothes found on Mrs. Smith, 4 on John, and 2 on Richard. I may have that backwards, but that's where we are with it. Would those bags of clothing prevent flies from reaching the bodies?
Well, they certainly would provide some interference. Whether they would definitively prevent all flies from getting there 100%, I can't say. It would likely interfere with the process, though.
Would you expect to have found some fly larvae on these bodies if the Smiths were killed on the 28th and they were not discovered until the 31st?
Yes, that would be likely.
And would that be something that a pathologist would make note of?
Yes, sir.
And why would they make note of that?
Well, a forensic pathologist normally makes note of the postmortem condition of the body. That ranges from the general appearance of the body to specific postmortem changes that indicate both the condition of the body and sometimes assist in trying to make estimates of how long that person has been dead. So we look for the classic postmortem changes like stiffening of the muscles, which is rigor mortis, settling of the blood, which is Rigor Mortis, cooling of the body, and any other postmortem breakdown or effects on the body, which includes, if you go far enough out in time, decomposition, and also includes what you've been inquiring about, namely if there's any insect or any other animal activity that's been subjected or the body's been subjected to.
Now, in this particular case, it has been posited that the bodies were killed on the 28th of July because on the 29th of July, John Smith missed a doctor's appointment. Voncile Smith's medication was not taken for the evening of the 28th of July, and some of the mail was not brought in. You're aware of that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Those are all human factors, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, are there medical factors that would contradict that theory?
In this instance, yes, sir.
Okay. Oh, also, Mr. Richard Smith's telephone was not used from the 28th through the time the bodies were found. That's another human factor, is it not?
Yes, sir.
Let's talk about the medical or scientific factors as to why that may not be the correct time of death. Can you tell us about that?
Well, again, the human factors that you've summarized are indeed the type of evidence that forensic pathologists do collect and do take note of. The medical or scientific factors, to me, are even more important in this case. The types of medical factors that I'm referring to are precisely the types of postmortem changes that I just briefly summarized in the immediately prior answer. So forensic pathologists look for the postmortem condition of the body. Is the body in rigor mortis or not? Because rigor mortis is a process where the stiffening of the muscles starts at some point after death. It reaches a maximum, it holds there for a while, then it recedes and eventually goes away completely. And that process has a fairly well-defined time frame, although it's a chemical reaction, so it's dependent on temperature. But that's the process of coming on, maximum, hold, go away. So that sequence is important for me when I'm looking at trying to get a reasonable estimate of how long this person's been dead. Another one of the postmortem changes that I mentioned earlier is called Rigor Mortis, or lividity, and that's when the blood settles in the body after death because there's no longer any heartbeat or circulation, so gravity takes over, the blood settles, the areas that are down relative to gravity get engorged and usually get pink or purple, and after some time the blood in those blood vessels that has settled congeals as a postmortem phenomenon, and then that lividity, the discoloration on that side of the skin, is fixed in place. That's important at looking at positioning and identifying death. It is much less helpful in terms of trying to figure out estimate of timing of death. So I would be looking at those things, in particular the rigor mortis. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier that's also very useful in the relatively earlier time period after death is body temperature. If you have the luxury of a measured body temperature of the body at the scene and the ambient temperature of the scene, you can employ those to make some reasonable estimates as to the time frame of the cooling of that body, and that can also help you to figure out the timing. And again, the other factors that we've already touched on that may not be necessarily as precise but might be something you would still want to look at include things like insect activity, animal activity, eventually, again, if you go a little farther out in time, decomposition of the body beginning. Those are all things I look for to try to get an estimate of the postmortem interval.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. It has been discussed that both Richard Thomas and Smith and Voncile Smith suffered from diabetes. Does this make a difference in making a determination as to a time of death?
I'm aware that diabetes was a diagnosis from the history for them. And the answer really is maybe, but probably not. So simply having diabetes by itself is not likely to make a big difference in the progression of those postmortem changes that I described. So the estimation of time of death, or again, I keep using purposely the word estimation. Remember, we're not determining a time of death like to the minute or the hour. That's not possible. But by and large, the process of estimating how long the person has been dead likely will not be affected by diabetes, except for one factor. If the person is diabetic and the blood sugar is out of control, so the blood sugar is very high at the time of death, then the extra sugar in the blood serves as a source of nutrition, if you will, for the bacteria that are already inside your body. So you may get some acceleration of the decompositional process if the person is diabetic and has a very high blood sugar at the time of death. That's a possibility.
Was there an indication that either Voncile Smith or Richard Smith had that extraordinarily high concentration of sugar in their blood?
There's no way, based on the evidence that we have, that we can determine that. The only way that you might be able to assess that post-mortem is through measuring the sugar in the fluid that's inside the eye, and that wasn't done here. That's not even always reliable because the elevated sugar in the eye fluid doesn't stay that way forever post-mortem. So that's the only way that I'm aware of that might have been a way to address that, but to my knowledge, that wasn't done.
Okay. How about Benadryl? There's some indication that both Voncile Smith and John Smith had some Benadryl. I think John had it in his bile and Voncile had it in her liver.
Correct.
Or gallbladder.
Her liver tissue.
Liver. Okay. Can you address that?
Yes, the medication diphenhydramine, which we commonly known by its trade name of Benadryl, was detected chemically in the liver tissue of Voncile Smith and in the bile, which is the fluid that's produced by the liver, in John Smith. Now, the presence, first of all, in one of them it was just listed as present, and the other it was just listed as present, and it was qualified with the word trace, meaning very small concentration. The presence of a medication in the liver or the bile is only an indication that that person had taken that medication in a relatively recent time frame. I can't give you an exact time frame for how long Benadryl would stay in the liver or in the bile, but it's indication of relatively recent usage because many drugs and medications are metabolized or broken down in the liver, so you can find them or their breakdown products in the liver, and because the liver secretes the bile, you can frequently find them in the bile itself. All that means is that the person had taken it and had metabolized it. The distinction here is that if you want to conclude that a person is under the influence of that drug or medication, that it's active at the time, you have to find it in the blood, because it's only when it's in the bloodstream does that indicate that it is circulating around the body and having an effect on you. If you take Benadryl for a period of time, then you stop taking it, you will then have some period of time later, after it clears from your blood, where it can still be in your liver, but it's no longer affecting you. So having found it in the liver in one and the bile in the other tells us absolutely nothing about whether it was having any effect on them at the time they died.
Now, were the bodies out of rigor mortis?
The observations made at the death scene that afternoon, the bodies of John Smith and Richard Smith were in mild degree of rigor mortis, and then on the following day at the autopsy, the rigor mortis had dissipated completely. At the death scene, the body of Voncile Smith did not have rigor mortis, so that had actually passed through.
Why would there be slight rigor mortis on John and Richard and no rigor mortis on Voncile?
The body of Voncile Smith appears to have progressed a little further in the postmortem changes than did the bodies of John and Richard Smith. Now, why she had moved a little farther and a little faster, I can't say with certainty. We don't have a room temperature or a body temperature on her at the scene, but several factors are in play and several factors might be in play. What I can tell you is in play here is that, number one, she was obese, and obesity tends to hold the body heat in after death, and that accelerates these postmortem processes, especially things like rigor mortis and the beginning of decomposition, because those are chemical processes, and warmer temperature makes chemical processes go faster. So obesity plays a role, though in fairness all three of them were. I also note that she was found under the much larger pile of clothing, so she had more material on top of her body that would then hold in the heat. That might account for the fact that she advanced a little farther and a little faster than the two men did.
Go ahead.
I don't know, because we don't have a room temperature measurement, I don't know if that room was warmer than the other room. That's one possibility. And then the other possibility that I can't prove is that the issue of diabetes. If her blood sugar were out of control, it could have contributed to her progressing faster than the other men.
Were you surprised that the temperature of Voncile was not taken?
Yes, I was.
Why?
Well, the medical examiner representatives did a thorough job in terms of documenting the conditions of the bodies at the scene, which is extremely important, because by the time you get to the autopsy, the bodies have been moved, they've typically been refrigerated overnight, there's more passage of time, so the postmortem condition of the body, things like rigor mortis, is much less reliable the next day at the autopsy as compared to the observation at the scene. So they did document those things at the scene, and they went to the effort to do both body temperature and room temperature for both of the men, which I thought was very helpful. I don't really understand why, if you're doing that work and getting that level of detail on two of the three victims, why you would not do it on the third.
There was some conversation yesterday that one of the reasons that Voncile's body temperature was not taken was because of the decomposition of her body at the time she was found. Can you address that?
Yes, there's no reason not to try to take her temperature, even if she's undergoing some decomposition. Sure, there is the possibility that the body temperature measurement may not be as reliable, or you might think twice about it, but there's no physical or technical reason you can't take the body of you can't take the temperature of a body that has slightly more advanced decomposition. You know, it's not like she was skeletonized where there's no body tissue to measure anymore. So it easily could have been done, and in my opinion, since they went to that trouble for the other two, they should have done it for her too.
Does that also hold true for not getting the room temperature?
Yes, sir.
Now, you said that the Rigor Mortis doesn't really factor into when the time of death was or the day of death?
Correct. Rigor Mortis, first of all, is much too variable in when it becomes fixed, when it comes on, when it becomes fixed. So it's really not very helpful and very precise. It's much better as an indication of death, and it is much more useful in terms of positioning of the body and whether a body has been moved after death. But for time of death, it really doesn't help.
Now, if you would, please discuss the body temperatures of John and Richard Smith and how that plays into what their day of death could have been.
Yes, the two factors that I think are most important here for my estimation of date of death, or I keep referring to postmortem interval, because even though that's a little maybe more confusing terminology, what I'm really trying to determine is, can I figure out roughly how long has it been since death, as opposed to, I don't want to buy into terminology like I can give you the time of death. But the two factors were the rigor mortis that we've discussed to some degree, and the temperature that you've just now asked me about. And I think the body temperature for these two men is very important. We have measured room temperatures for both of them at 72.2 degrees, so kind of within the realm of what I would characterize as normal room temperature. That's important because the literature and the experience as to cooling of a body depends on various factors, one of which is the ambient temperature. So it makes a big difference if you have somebody at roughly normal room temperature, the 68, 72 range, as opposed to a person who dies in the middle of a snowstorm where it's 20 degrees. So starting from that point of a quote-unquote normal room temperature, the two men had body temperatures that were down, one was down 16 degrees and the other 14.7 degrees, and I'm basing that on using 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit as a normal body temperature. And again, in fairness, that's also the normal body temperature that we think of, 98.6, is the middle of the bell curve. Body temperatures do vary from person to person. They vary from time to time during the day in the same person. But in order to get some reasonable average that fits for humans, 98.6 is a very good starting point. So the two...
Excuse me,
Yes.
could I... The testimony was that John was 6'4" and 293 pounds, and Richard was 6'5" and 311 pounds. You're aware of that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And what that really speaks to, their height is not germane by itself to the body temperature issue, although the combination of height and weight is what really allows us to assess state of nutrition, in particular obesity, and both of those gentlemen would qualify for being diagnosed as being obese. The importance of that being that obese people have thicker fat pads under their skin, and it holds the body heat in longer, so they'll cool somewhat slower. But we have the two of them in a room with the same room temperature, and the two body temperatures were measured within about a half an hour of each other roughly the 5:30 p.m. range that day. And so you have one is about 16 degrees of body temperature loss. The other one, I said 14.7. Frankly, the 0.7 is probably shaving it closer than we can. So let's say roughly 15 and 16 degrees of body temperature loss for the two of them. So the first thing that comes to my mind is that the temperature loss for the two men in the same room temperature was very similar. I mean, 1 degree difference is not very much. So those are both consistent in terms of rate of cooling of two men in the same room temperature, both of whom are obese, both of whom have some of the clothing piled on top of them that would also keep the body heat in. In terms of using the loss of body temperature to try to make estimates of how long that person's been dead, we don't know exactly how fast each person will cool, but we do have literature that gives us guidelines and ranges for how rapidly human beings will cool under normal room temperature type settings. And the starting point to make your estimates is at about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. And so if we do the math, do the 15 to 16 degrees of body temperature loss, and then divide that by 1.5 degrees, you end up with the range of 10 or 11 hours or so of postmortem interval. Now, we know that these two men are going to cool after death somewhat more slowly than the textbook average, partly because of their obesity, partly because they're covered with some of that clothing piled on top of them. So those factors will hold the heat in. So then I start looking at estimates of slower cooling than 1.5 degrees per hour. And if you take it down to 1 degree per hour, a 1/3 slower rate, then at 15, 16 degrees, now we're looking at 15 or 16 hours. If you take it down, let's go down to 3/4 of a degree per hour, half of the kind of textbook standard rate. And then instead of 10 or 11, we're at the 20, 22 range. And then because I am concerned that their obesity and the clothing piled on top of them could have a substantial effect, let's take it all the way down to 1/2 degree per hour. And at that point, you're getting into the 30 plus 32 hour range, that neighborhood. So finally, if I then take those estimates of the time from the temperature, and I figure it is likely going to be in the longer end of those ranges because of the confounding factors of the obesity and the clothing on top of them. So I'm out into the 30 plus hours range. And then let's marry that up with the other postmortem change, which is the rigor mortis, or the stiffening of the muscles. Knowing that a normal-sized person at room temperature, wearing light clothing, with no other confounding factors, no direct heat applied, no cooling, no wind, no water. Rigor mortis will go through its process. It'll take about 12 hours to get to maximum. It'll hold for about 12 hours. It'll recede over about 12 hours. That gets me to 36 hours, and the textbook will tell you it takes roughly 36 to 48 hours for that whole process. Rigor mortis starting, maximum, holding, dissipating, and disappearing. So 36 hours, maybe 48 hours. So here we have the two men where we also have the body temperatures, and we have body temperatures that are taking us out to the 24 to 36 hour range roughly for postmortem interval. And we have both of them with mild, slight rigor mortis observed on this death scene, consistent with rigor mortis that is passing away. It's on its downslope. and you have the next morning, after the bodies have been moved and refrigerated and brought out for autopsy, the rigor mortis is gone, which confirms that it was on the downslope, not on the upslope. So rigor mortis at that kind of mile level on the way out is also consistent with the 36-hour range or thereabouts. And especially if we remember that the chemical process of rigor mortis is going to be at least slightly accelerated by the obesity and the clothing on top of the men. So the 36-hour range is actually very reasonable. So I've got body temperature that's taken me out into at least 24 and likely as much as 36 hours. I've got rigor mortis that's taking me out into the 36 hour range as well. Those two are highly consistent, and hence my estimate that their postmortem interval is likely at least 24 hours and could easily be up to around 36 hours.
Which would put when would that put the death? If they were, the body temperatures were taken around 5:30 on the 31st.
Right, so if we go...
5:30 p.m. on the 31st.
Correct. So if we go back 24 hours from that, that's about 5:30 p.m. on the 30th. You go back another 12 hours, now you're into the 5:30 a.m. on the 30th. So we're going back into the 30th. If you stretched it even farther than where I was comfortable in what I just described to you, you'd maybe be getting into late of the 29th.
Late on the 29th?
Yes.
Okay. Now, this is scientific, correct?
Yes, it is based on science.
And there's any way you can change the rigor mortis factor?
No, there's no way I can change the observed science of the rigor mortis factor or of the temperature factor. The only thing I can say is, as I've said multiple times, in fairness, we have some factors that we don't control for. We don't know exactly what their body temperatures were when they died. We don't know exactly what percentage of change the obesity and the clothing piled on them will give in terms of percentage of slowing or speeding anything. But the science of what I've described for you is what it is.
So, based on the science, forgetting the human factors of not taking your medicine or not making a doctor's appointment or answering your telephone, the scientific factors put the time of death, giving every bit of leeway to a longer time of death, still puts it very late on the 29th or early on the 30th?
Yes, sir.
Now, there was some testimony yesterday that time of death is not important or hard to estimate or of really no value. You obviously disagree with that.
I do, sir.
And why do you disagree with that?
I disagree with it because, first of all, it is important. Whether you can accurately determine it in any given case or not, of course it's important. I don't think it's fair to say it's of no value. The one statement you made in that question that I will generally agree with is that it is very difficult. Determining, let me go back, not determining, estimating a time of death or a postmortem interval does carry with it, as I think I just mentioned, a number of factors for which we cannot control precisely. It makes a difference what the ambient temperature is. Well, in this case, we know that. It makes a difference what body temperature the person starts at, and some people die with slightly higher or lower body temperatures, and for that matter, some people die in a high fever. So we don't know that, we can't measure that. The factors that can alter or adjust how rapidly you cool or how rapidly you go into stiffening the muscles, things like obesity and whether you're clothed or not, whether you're in water or whether you're in a direct sunlight, can certainly have serious effects, and we frequently can't control for them precisely or mathematically. So it is a process that has difficulty. It is a process that makes you be very cautious about it. But it's also a process of trying to estimate postmortem interval that sometimes is reasonable, especially if you're trying to compare the known facts and the medical facts with an account or a story of what happened or when it happened. I mean, I can give you, I don't mean to be silly here, I can give you a very extreme example. If you show me a body in temperate climate in the woods, it's completely skeletonized, and there's an allegation that this person was killed 2 days earlier. Well, I can tell you that the postmortem interval there is such a complete mismatch that I can tell you that's just not consistent. Now, I know we don't have something that extreme here, but there are times when the comparison between the scientific and the historical is still valuable, even if I can't tell you they died at exactly this time on that day.
Now, are there books written for students in pathology that talk about time of death?
Oh, certainly. There are textbooks and medical literature about different aspects of estimating time of death and what the postmortem changes are. I have a thin hardcover book that's devoted entirely to estimating time of death in the early postmortem period. So yes, there indeed is forensic medical literature in this regard.
And does that forensic medical literature pertaining to time of death talk about body temperature?
Yes, it does.
And is it scientifically recognized that body temperature is an important factor in determining time of death?
Yes, sir. Excuse me.
Is there any question about that in the forensic, or the board-certified forensic pathology community?
No, sir.
Are you aware of any movements that say within that community that we need to stop looking at body temperature for time of death, or body temperature is irrelevant?
No, I'm not aware of any movement that say the body temperature is irrelevant. Certainly, I stand by what I've already mentioned, namely that I acknowledge that there may be difficulties in trying to estimate a postmortem interval, and that sometimes you have to be very cautious with it, whether it's temperature or other factors. And certainly I have some colleagues who would say, at least in a given case, I'm not comfortable giving you an estimate in this case or that case, but the concept of whether temperature itself is important or irrelevant, no, it is not irrelevant.
And have you given every benefit of the doubt in your estimate of the day of death to stretch it out as long as you can?
I really have, sir, yes.
What if the room temperature was higher than 72 degrees?
If the room temperature were higher, then it would, excuse me, it would slow down the cooling process of the body.
So you're still, even if the room temperature higher, are you still comfortable with the numbers you gave or the days you gave?
As long as the room temperature is in the same range, I mean, if you, again, I don't mean to be silly, but if you told me the room temperature was 120 degrees, I think that would throw things off. But somewhere in that roughly normal room temperature range, no, it won't change what I've just testified to.
And it's important in forensic pathology to know what the room temperature is that correct?
If you're going to make any estimates of postmortem interval based on body temperature, yes, you need to know the ambient temperature in which the body was.
And is that why the people who took the body temperature also made note of the temperature in the room?
Yes, sir.
Is there anything else the jury needs to know about the autopsy.
Judge, I object.
Okay. As far as Voncile's concerned, there was more disintegration of her body than there was of the two men.
She had a slightly greater degree of decomposition beginning, yes, sir.
Thank you. I couldn't think of decomposition. How do you account for that other than her weight and more clothing piled upon her?
Well, again, I think the more clothing piled upon her is likely to be significant in terms of differentiating her from the two men. And other than that, I would have to know, as I mentioned earlier, was the room temperature where she was a bit higher? Well, again, did she have an out-of-control elevated blood sugar when she died? I can't determine those things. I can only offer those as possible explanations.
Now, as far as the Voncile is concerned, they could have taken a liver temperature for her. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that was just not done.
Correct.
And the estimate you gave for the day of death, which would have been late on the 29th or early on the 30th, at the furthest out, that took into consideration all those factors and only applied to John Smith and Richard Thomas Smith. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
And you don't know what it would have been for Voncile. Is that also correct?
Correct, given that I don't have the same kind of data to work from, body temperature, room temperature, I can't be as precise with her.
I don't have any further questions of this witness.
Mr. Meyer?
Myers.
Dr. Arden, forensic pathologist, typically your job as a medical examiner is to determine the cause and manner of death. Is that accurate?
That's the ultimate, most important function. I mean, of course, there are other things the medical examiner does in the course of the work to arrive at those conclusions, but that's the ultimate product, if you will, yes.
Now, what were you hired for to do in this case?
I was retained in this case to review all the evidence related to the forensic pathology, cause of death, manner of death, postmortem interval, death scene from the standpoint of a forensic pathologist, to provide advice and, if necessary, opinions on those issues.
And the manner of death of all three was homicide. You agree?
I do, sir.
And you testified that you relied on the 3 autopsy reports, the medical examiner's investigator's report, the photographs of the scene, the photographs from the autopsy, police reports, and various depositions. Did I leave anything out?
I think there were some statements, they may count as police reports, and I also mentioned the toxicology reports.
Right. How many hours do you have in?
Before today, I have just about 20 hours in.
And what's your fee for testifying today?
Given that I came yesterday, I think we were doing a flat 10-hour trial day.
And what's the fee?
The same $400 an hour. I don't differentiate that.
So right now you're at $12,000?
I'm at about $12,000, having worked on the case for 14 months and haven't been paid yet. Yes, sir.
Were you informed that the bodies were behind closed doors?
Meaning that the doors to the house was closed?
No, sir. The doors to the rooms were closed.
I believe so. I don't recall that detail exactly, but I believe so.
And the dog was not inside those rooms?
Frankly, sir, I don't recall that detail.
Bugs can only have access to the body if they can gain access, correct?
Yes, sir.
So Egyptian mummies, they don't have bugs in them because they don't have access to the body.
Well, I think in part because Egyptian mummies are in places that don't have the same kind of bugs either.
Yes,
It's a
sir.
vastly different condition.
But my point is, just like your extreme example, about 2 days later, the body's decomposed, that's not accurate, right?
Yes, sir.
So extreme example, bodies that don't have access to bugs or bugs that don't have access to bodies, there's not going to be bugs, correct?
Correct. If there's no access, the bugs can't get there.
Now, a lot of time spent on time of death in your testimony, and I think you were pretty clear, a lot of different variables, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's why you kept qualifying your answer as an estimate, correct?
Yes, that's all it can ever be, is an estimate.
You can't sit here and say within any degree of scientific certainty that it occurred on the 29th at 10 o'clock, on the 30th at 9 a.m., on the 28th at 7 p.m.
I can't give you with scientific or medical certainty any estimate that gives you a precise hour and date, although the third example you gave, going back to the 28th, is outside the range that I testified to.
I understand the range you testified to. Let's talk about some of the variables. High blood pressure, what would be the rate of cooling?
Blood pressure would have no effect on that whatsoever.
Okay. Diabetes, what's the rate of cooling?
Diabetes most likely would not have an effect, but if the person had extremely elevated blood sugar, actually, I'm sorry, I was answering a question that you didn't ask, more about decomposition. Rate of cooling should not be affected by diabetes.
Okay. Adrenaline,
Very hard to say because adrenaline tends to have mostly cardiovascular effects. Your blood pressure goes up, your heartbeat goes up, you become behaviorally more attentive and in tune. I guess it's physiologically possible. You could elevate your body temperature a little bit with adrenaline, but I think that's probably negligible.
okay. Do you have a formula is my question.
No, I don't think there is such a formula.
What about if someone's sick?
Well, again, and you're asking me in terms of the rate of cooling. The rate of cooling probably isn't going to change at all. The question is what your starting point is. If someone is sick and has a substantial fever, and you start at time of death with an elevated body temperature, then it will take you longer to get down to a given number. So that could confound the effects, or rather the estimate.
Well, the estimates you gave was, let's start at 1.5 degrees per hour. You said that's textbook, not taking into account any factors, right?
Yes, sir.
And then you said, all right, let's go to 1 degree per hour. Let's go to half a degree per hour. And I think that's where you stop.
Yes, sir.
What I'm asking you is what's the rate of cooling if someone's sick?
The rate of cooling is the same. What you're really asking is, you're asking a question that has to do with the starting point, not the rate of cooling. The rate of cooling shouldn't change. The starting point of when you start cooling could be different in the circumstances you're giving me, which could indeed prolong the estimate of postmortem interval if we say, all right, the body temperature is 84 degrees, just to take a number. If you start at 98.6, it takes roughly X number of hours to get there at the given rate. If you start at 104, it takes longer to get there, but the rate doesn't change.
You testified that obesity would have an effect.
Yes, sir.
What's the rate of cooling for a 234-pound, 77-year-old woman?
There is no determined specific rate for a given body weight, or age also is not relevant in the question. It is well known that obesity will slow the cooling of the body. It'll slow the rate. I can't give you a formula of exactly how much it will slow, and that's why I used various different rates below the standard 1.5 degrees.
And so you're not testifying to this jury that these are the rates. You're just estimating. If this was 0.5 degrees per hour, this would be the outcome, correct?
Right, I'm testifying that the 1.5 degrees is a very fair starting point based on broad experience of human body cooling. I'm testifying that there's good reason to believe that these 3 people in particular would cool at a slower rate. I'm then trying to give a broad range of estimates of how much slower would be potentially reasonable, so I can give you a range and that I'm not sticking to one number, you know, hard and fast as if I knew that were the only number.
If someone were to die in a sauna or a hot car death in the summer, the rate would be completely different, correct?
Yes, that would be, those would be extreme conditions unlike what we have here.
Where are you from, doctor?
I currently live in Northern Virginia.
And have you been to Pensacola in July?
No, sir. I've been to some hot places, though. I live near D.C. It's plenty hot and humid.
What effect does humidity have?
Humidity is not going to have a great effect. Humidity is a bigger issue with a live person when we're talking about sweating and so on, which dead people don't do. Humidity, to my knowledge, is not normally factored into the rate of cooling post-mortem. If anything, it potentially could slow it down a little bit, but I'm not aware that it is a major factor in the cooling of a dead person as opposed to a live person.
The temperature of inside the house, you said if it was a normal range or a normal room temperature, I think is what you called it. What's, in your mind, what's the normal room temperature?
Roughly 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit.
And I guess that's another subjective type question. I mean, it could vary for person to person, correct?
I'm not sure I understand.
When I say what's a normal room temperature, I may keep my house at 78 degrees. You may keep your house at 62 or 65, correct?
Many people will keep their houses at different temperatures. I think the concept of normal room temperature is something that has, at least I've seen in the literature, in the 68, 70, 72 range. Of course, anyone's entitled to keep it hotter or colder for their purposes.
Right. Now, the defense attorney asked you to disregard the fact that the pill bottles still had Tuesday PM. John didn't appear for his doctor's appointment on Wednesday. No more phone calls from Richard after Tuesday. Newspapers in the trash or in the mailbox from Wednesday through Friday. Were you aware of all that?
I believe I was, sir, yes.
And if you, as a medical examiner, would you ignore that?
No, and I don't think defense counsel asked me to ignore it. He asked me to consider the medical or scientific factors aside from that. And no, I would not ignore that.
You made mention that Dr. Minyard had started her autopsies within 10-minute period. I mean, the start of an autopsy is documenting the bodies as they come, correct?
It's documenting the time that you particularly attend to that body to perform that procedure.
Right, I'm saying the first steps you do when you do an autopsy is you photograph the body as it comes into your office.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Would you say people's observations of rigor mortis are subjective?
First of all, it depends upon which people. We're talking about observations of rigor mortis by forensic professionals who do this for a living as opposed to the rest of the world. Observations of rigor mortis by people who don't do this and aren't trained in it are much less reliable and probably much more subjective. The assessment of the degree of rigor mortis is, of course, to some degree subjective even by professionals because we don't measure it with an instrument. So I think there is some reasonable uniformity among professionals who are experienced with this, what's mild, moderate, and severe. But given that it is one's sense of it, I agree there is a degree of subjectivity.
You would also agree that a bloody, dried arm would be more difficult to lift?
No, sir. I'm not sure why blood on the arm makes it more difficult to lift.
A dry arm or a dry limb would be more difficult to lift.
I'm not understanding. More difficult than what?
That's okay, sir. So disregarding what you called human factors, you only relied on two things, and that's rigor mortis and body temperature. And you relied on it knowing that there are various factors that you cannot account for scientifically.
Yes, sir, that's part of that process.
So given those variables, can you say these deaths did not occur on Tuesday? Human factors, medical factors, can you say within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty these bodies were not killed on Tuesday?
I cannot tell you it's impossible. I can tell you that Tuesday is inconsistent with the scientific and medical evidence.
I don't have anything else to.
Now, what I had asked you to do was look purely at the scientific, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in looking at the scientific factors, you gave did you give every benefit to a longer period of time?
Yes, sir.
And that longer period of time still puts you late on the 29th or early on the 30th, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, does science lie?
No.
Judge.
Oops, sorry. Excuse me.
Okay. So the question of the rigor mortis, you said that some of it is subjective, is that correct?
To some degree, yes.
Was it subjective that it was gone on the day the autopsies were performed, which was the 1st of August?
I would not call that subjective. I think the absence of rigidity is pretty much a clear-cut factor, as Dr. Minyard observed.
So then that would be consistent with what the attendants found at the scene, with it being minimal.
Yes, the fact that it was slight or mild or minimal at the death scene and was absent the following morning is very much consistent.
So their findings are consistent with Dr. Minyard.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Myers didn't finish his question about a dry arm. The fact that there is blood all over an arm make a difference
To which factor?
to the lifting it or the weight of it?
Well, if you're literally talking about the weight, or are we talking about rigidity? Because
Rigidity.
if it's the weight, the blood on the arm is going to add a little bit of weight. That's not significant. In terms of rigidity, the dried blood is not going to have any significant effect. If you can break the rigidity, you can break it with the blood on it as well. That's not significant.
How does one check for rigor mortis when one comes upon a dead body?
One manipulates various parts of the body trying to move different joints, because the muscles provide resistance when they get stiff to the movement of the joints. So ideally, you would try in several parts of the body. For instance, the jaw, as I'm demonstrating on myself, you try to move the jaw passively. You can frequently do it with the arms and the legs, where if an arm is bent at the elbow and you try to straighten out the arm and feel what resistance there is, similarly in the legs.
And a lack of rigor mortis would mean that you can easily pull the jaw down or move the arm like that, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's what was found right before the autopsy, that it could be easily pulled down and moved out.
That's what was described by Dr. Minyard, I presume, at the beginning of each of the autopsies.
And there was some talk about your initiating this conversation with 1.5 degrees per hour as far as the body cooling. Where did that number or figure come from?
It comes from the forensic medical literature and the studies in this regard.
And is what is taught in medical school?
Well, it's really taught in forensic pathology training.
Okay.
They don't care about this in medical school, unfortunately.
Okay, when you get to forensic pathology training, is that when it's discussed?
Yes, sir.
And is that the standard that they say to use?
That is the standard as your starting point, which you acknowledge may have to be adjusted for some conditions, but that's the most middle-of-the-road starting point when you're conducting such an exercise.
And you took it all the way down to 1/2 degree per hour, correct?
Yes, sir.
Was that to give every benefit to make it the lengthier number?
Yes, considering the obesity and the clothing on top of the bodies, I felt that I needed to make estimates that would lengthen the time frame, because that's what the effect would be of those factors.
And although as a forensic pathologist, you would take into account the human factors, which I've described as the mail, the phone, missed appointment, you would take that into account, right?
I do.
Do those human factors override the scientific factor, in your opinion? I can ask his opinion on that.
Should I step down? No.
As a forensic pathologist, when you are dealing with human factors and scientific evidence, do you give greater weight to the scientific evidence?
As a generality, yes, sir.
Okay. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Doctor. You can step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good. This witness is free to leave.
All right, you're released, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Can counsel approach? All right, Mr. Jury, we're going to take a break at this time, and they'll have time to walk around or outside if y'all want to, or go to the vending machines. So we'll be in recess for about 20 to 30 minutes.